Good evening. You're listening to the Dead Ball Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie. Tonight, we're thinking about the color gold, the specific shade of gold that covered Los Angeles at the turn of the millennium, the Lakers of 2000 to 2004. It's a period everyone knows. 3 championships in a row, a dynasty. But dynasties are remembered in static images, a trophy lift, a final score in the paper. We forget the feeling of existing around that team in that specific time. We forget the atmosphere in the building. Tonight, we're going to sit with that atmosphere for a while. Part 1. The Illusion of a Team. History has a tendency to smooth out the jagged edges of memory. It makes things look inevitable in retrospect. Living through that era felt anything but inevitable. It felt precarious. It felt volatile. It felt like walking a tightrope every single night, always waiting for the balance to shift, for the fall to finally happen. Think about Los Angeles itself, a city built on image, the facade, the way things look under the right lighting. The Lakers were the ultimate LA production. They had the celebrities courtside, the bright, blinding lights of the Staples Center, the polished floors so shiny you could almost see the reflection of the banners that weren't there yet. It looked perfect. It looked like a machine, humming along in perfect synchronicity. But that was the illusion. If you sat close enough, if you tuned in to those late-night West Coast feeds when the rest of the world was asleep, you could see the truth in the quiet moments. You could see the cracks in the paint. A team is supposed to be a living organism. It's supposed to breathe together. It's supposed to be a collective that finds strength in unity. The 2000 Lakers were not that organism. They were an assembly of giants who happened to be wearing the same color uniform. There was no warmth in that huddle. There was no casual brotherhood you might have seen with other great teams. It was all professional distance. Phil Jackson was the master of ceremonies for this grand illusion. He brought the Zen to LA. He brought the incense and the meditation and the philosophy books. He was trying to create a collective consciousness in a locker room full of individualists. He wanted them to lose themselves in the triangle offense. He spoke about selflessness as a tactical advantage. But how do you tell Shaquille O'Neal to lose himself? How do you tell a man who is the most physically dominant human being on the planet that he needs to be part of a system? Shaq didn't need a system. Shaq was the system. He was the gravity that everything else in the universe had to orbit around. When he caught the ball in the post, the entire arena stopped breathing, waiting for the impact. He was a force of nature. And then you had Kobe Bryant. Kobe was not interested in losing himself in anything. He was interested in finding himself. He was 21 years old, possessed by a profound, almost terrifying ambition. He was trying to outwork his own shadow. He didn't want to be a part of the triangle. He wanted to be the single point of the spear. He saw Shaq's natural dominance and thought it wasn't enough. He saw a man with God-given gifts who sometimes took a night off, who skipped a practice. For Kobe, that was an insult to the game he had dedicated his entire life to mastering. So you had this constant, low-frequency vibration. It was the sound of 2 massive tectonic egos rubbing against each other. It was not the sound of harmony. It was the sound of grinding gears, of metal scraping against metal. You'd see it most clearly in the fourth quarter. The game is on the line. In a normal team, the ball moves to the best shot. The flow of the game dictates the outcome. With these Lakers, every pass in the last 5 minutes felt like a message, a negotiation. If Kobe took the difficult fading jumper over 2 defenders, it was a declaration of independence, a statement that the future had arrived. If Shaq demanded the ball, throwing his weight around, screaming for the entry pass, it was a reminder of who owned the building, who built the foundation. The other players, Derek Fisher, Rick Fox, Robert Horry, they weren't just players, they were diplomats. They spent 48 minutes a night trying to keep a full-blown civil war from breaking out on national television.
They managed the moods. They knew when to stay quiet, when to give a knowing nod. They were the true teammates, holding the whole fragile thing together with sheer willpower and diplomacy. It was a dynasty built on a fault line. We all knew the earthquake was coming. We just didn't know when. We were mesmerized by the height of the building, by the spectacle of all that talent, but we forgot to look at the ground it was standing on. It was the most successful dysfunction in the history of sports, a masterpiece of tension. We called it a team because they won, because the newspapers needed a word for it, but deep down, we knew better. We knew we were watching a temporary alliance of convenience between two men who couldn't stand the thought of losing, but couldn't stand the thought of sharing the credit either. That was the illusion. The gold wasn't solid.
It was a thin, beautiful veneer over something much more volatile, and as the years went on, that veneer started to peel, slowly, painfully, for all of us to see. Part 2. Shaq, Kobe, and the weight of hierarchy. To understand this team, you have to understand the physical reality of the locker room in those years. It wasn't a sanctuary. It wasn't a place of shared breath or collective relief. It was a place with a ladder, and every single rung on that ladder was made of ego, expectation, and a very specific kind of silence. Hierarchy in sports is usually a comfort. It's a map. You know who the veteran is, you know who the rookie is, you know who the closer is. But with the Lakers at the turn of the millennium, the hierarchy was a shifting, living thing. It was a weight that everyone in the building had to carry, from the stars to the guys at the end of the bench to the fans watching the flickering screen at 2 a.m. In the beginning, the order of things was simple. It was Shaq's team. There was a natural law to it. Shaquille O'Neal had arrived in Los Angeles as a finished masterpiece, the big Aristotle, the most dominant physical force the game had seen since Wilt. Watching him back then wasn't really like watching basketball. It was like watching the environment change. When Shaq moved, the air in the arena seemed to displace. The defense didn't just play him, they warped around him. You'd see 3, sometimes 4 grown men leaning their entire body weight against him, and he would just turn. He would drop step, and the floorboards would groan, and the rim would scream. Shaq wanted to be loved. He needed it. He played with a certain lightness, a sense that being the greatest shouldn't have to be a miserable, solitary grind. He was an entertainer. He wanted the locker room to be a place of laughter, of booming voices and pranks. He saw his dominance as a gift he shared with the world, and he expected the world, and his teammates, to be grateful for the show. And then there was Kobe. Kobe didn't care about the show. He didn't care about being loved, not then anyway.
He was 21 years old, and he was operating on a psychological frequency that most people can't even perceive. He looked at Shaq's lightness, and he saw it as a weakness. He saw the missed free throws, the off-season surgeries that were scheduled during training camp, the Shaq time conditioning. For Kobe, these weren't just quirks of a superstar, they were an insult to the game. He was a young man possessed by a ghost. He was chasing Michael, but he was also chasing an impossible version of himself. He didn't want to be part of a hierarchy, he wanted to be the standard by which all hierarchies were measured. Think about the tension that creates in a shared space. Think about being a teammate in that room. Someone like Rick Fox, Derek Fisher, or Brian Shaw. You are living in a house where the 2 most powerful people in your world aren't speaking. Or worse, they are speaking through the media. You wake up, you open the Los Angeles Times, and you see a quote from one directed at the other. You walk into practice, and you can feel the temperature drop. The ball itself became a political object. Imagine being the point guard. You're coming down the floor. You have the most dominant center in history sealed in the post, his hand up, his voice booming for the entry pass. And on the wing, you have the most gifted perimeter scorer of a generation, eyes burning, demanding the ball so he can prove he doesn't need the giant to win. Every pass was a choice. Every pass was a vote for a different philosophy. If you gave it to Shaq, you were choosing the present, the established order, the king. If you gave it to Kobe, you were choosing the future, the uprising, the revolution. You weren't just playing basketball, you were navigating a minefield of ego. The hierarchy wasn't a vertical line you could simply climb. It was two massive planets orbiting each other, their gravity constantly threatening to pull the entire solar system apart. Shaq wanted the respect of a king who had already conquered the world. Kobe wanted the autonomy of a god who was still creating his. You could feel that weight every time the intro started. When the lights went down at Staples and the announcer's voice boomed, there was a subconscious calculation in the crowd. Whose cheer was louder?
Who got the last introduction? Even the fans were forced into the hierarchy, forced to pick a side in a war that neither side was willing to admit was happening. Phil Jackson tried to manage this by stepping back. He used silence as a tool. He wanted them to figure out the hierarchy on their own, through the triangle offense, which is designed to be a meritocracy of the moment. But the triangle is a system for people who are willing to be equal. Shaq and Kobe were never going to be equal. One was the sun, and the other was a star that wanted to be a sun. It was a fascinating, terrible thing to watch in real time. We were seeing the greatest duo since Jordan and Pippen, but they were the inverse. Jordan and Pippen were a partnership of roles. Shaq and Kobe were a collision of identities. They were winning, yes, they were crushing the league, but the wins started to feel heavy. The hierarchy wasn't providing order anymore. It was providing friction. The more they won, the more the question of who is responsible for this began to rot the foundation. Shaq felt he was the engine. Kobe felt he was the driver, and neither one was willing to sit in the passenger seat. The atmosphere wasn't one of a dynasty on the rise. It was one of a dynasty under siege from within. We watched them, mesmerized by the brilliance, but we all felt the pressure. We knew that this kind of weight, this kind of psychological attrition couldn't be sustained forever. Something had to give. The ladder was going to break. Part 3. Winning without peace. There is a myth we tell ourselves about success. We like to believe that winning is a universal solvent, that it dissolves grudges, heals wounds, and turns rivals into brothers. We think that when the confetti falls and the hats are handed out, the bitterness of the season just evaporates into the rafters.
But if you watched the Lakers between 2001 and 2003, you knew that wasn't true. For that team, winning wasn't a cure, it was a stay of execution. It was a golden mask placed over a face that was beginning to contort in pain. Think about the 2001 postseason. It is statistically one of the most dominant stretches in the history of any sport. They went 15-1. They didn't just beat teams, they erased them. They went into San Antonio and Sacramento and Portland and treated those arenas like their own backyard. On the court, they were a hurricane. But if you looked at them during a timeout in the middle of a 20-point lead, the atmosphere was haunting. It was cold. There was this profound, heavy silence sitting between Shaq and Kobe on the bench. They weren't huddled together talking strategy. They weren't laughing. They were two men standing on opposite sides of a canyon, waiting for the workday to end so they could go back to their separate lives. Winning without peace is a very specific kind of exhaustion. It requires you to perform at the highest level of human capability while simultaneously suppressing a massive amount of internal resentment. It's like running a marathon while holding your breath. You can do it for a while because the adrenaline of the race keeps you going, but eventually the lungs start to burn. In those years, the victory parades in Los Angeles started to feel different. The first one, in 2000, was an explosion of pure, unadulterated joy. The city had been waiting for a decade. But by 2002, the third one, the energy had shifted. The fans were still there, the palm trees were still lined with people, but the air felt thin. You could see it in the eyes of the players. They looked like survivors of a war rather than champions of a game. Phil Jackson tried to govern this through the concept of detached engagement. He didn't want to fix their relationship anymore, he just wanted to manage the fallout. He sat there on his high stool, whistling through his fingers, watching his two stars play a game of anything you can do, I can do better within the flow of a championship series. The rest of the team lived in the crossfire. Imagine being Robert Horry or Rick Fox. You're a professional, you're a veteran. You know that if you just play your role, you'll get a ring. But you also know that you're living in a house where the parents are constantly one wrong word away from a divorce. You spend your nights at the hotel or on the team plane acting as a buffer. You're the one who pulls Kobe aside to tell him to look for the big man. You're the one who tells Shaq to stay focused on the boards when he's upset about not getting enough touches. The role players were the unsung heroes of that era, not because of their three-point shooting, but because of their emotional labor. They were the ones keeping the lid on the pressure cooker while the world watched the steam whistle. And then there was the 2002 Western Conference Finals against Sacramento. That series was the peak of the tension. It was a psychological war. The Kings were a team that actually liked each other. They played with a joy and a flow that made the Lakers look rigid and joyless. For 7 games, it felt like the world was finally going to tilt. Every time the Lakers fell behind, you could see the cracks widening. You could see the "I told you so" look starting to form. When Robert Horry hit that shot in Game 4, it saved the dynasty. But it didn't bring peace. It just gave them permission to keep fighting each other for another year. It validated the dysfunction. It told them that they could hate each other and still be the best in the world. And that is a dangerous lesson to learn. By 2003, the physical toll started to match the emotional one. Shaq's body was beginning to pay the price for years of carrying that much weight and that much contact. Kobe was becoming even more insular, even more obsessed with his own individual development. He was entering his prime, and he didn't want to wait for the giant to get healthy. He wanted to run. He wanted to fly.
He wanted to see what he could do without the safety net of the most dominant center in the world. When they finally lost to the Spurs in 2003, you saw it. You saw Kobe on the bench with tears in his eyes, but they weren't just tears of defeat. They were the tears of someone who realized the era of inevitability was over. The armor had been pierced. Winning without peace is like building a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. It can go higher than anyone ever imagined. It can be the most beautiful thing in the skyline. People will travel from all over the world just to look at it and marvel at the height of it. But deep down, the people inside the building know. They feel the slight sway when the wind blows. They see the tiny cracks in the drywall. They know that the structure wasn't built to last. They were 3-time champions. They were the undisputed kings of the basketball world. But if you walked into that locker room in the summer of 2003, you wouldn't have found a team that felt like they had conquered the world. You would have found a group of men who were quietly, desperately looking for an exit. Part 4. Why it had to end. There's a law in physics, entropy, the idea that everything, eventually, just moves toward disorder. Things break down, they lose their heat. For 4 years, the Lakers managed to ignore that law through sheer force of talent and a coach who treated basketball like a psychological puzzle. But by the fall of 2003, the puzzle had too many missing pieces. The 2003-2004 season didn't feel like a title defense. It felt like a corporate merger that was falling apart in real time. To try and hold the walls up, they brought in Gary Payton and Karl Malone. On paper, it was a super team before we really used that word every day. It was an insurance policy. If Shaq's body was giving out or Kobe was checked out, the veterans would provide a floor.
But you can't fix a structural crack by adding more weight to the roof. You don't solve a chemistry problem by adding more Hall of Fame egos to a room that was already out of oxygen. The vibe that year was just heavy. It was a slow, public unraveling. You had Kobe flying back and forth to Colorado for his legal case, and Shaq being loud about his contract and his place in the franchise. Those two weren't even on the same planet anymore, let alone the same page. When you watched them on the court, the joy was just gone. It was replaced by this grim, joyless efficiency that eventually stopped being efficient at all. You'd see Gary Payton looking confused in the triangle, probably wondering why he'd come to LA just to watch 2 guys have a Cold War. You'd see Karl Malone trying to be the adult in a locker room where the 2 most important people wouldn't even make eye contact. Then came the 2004 Finals in Detroit. The Pistons were the exact opposite of everything the Lakers had become. They didn't have a superstar, they just had 5 guys who played like a single fist. When the Lakers got to Detroit, they didn't just meet a better game plan, they met a team that actually functioned like one. The Pistons breathed together. The Lakers were just 5 separate islands that happened to be wearing the same jersey. In those quiet Michigan nights, the whole thing just dissolved.
You could see it in the way Shaq looked at the bench and the way Kobe kept looking at the rim like he could solve the problem alone. The silence between them had finally become louder than the crowd. The alliance had reached its expiration date. It had to end because the power struggle had hit a stalemate. To win at that level, you need a shared language. By 2004, Shaq and Kobe were speaking different dialects. Shaq wanted to be the patriarch, the guy who owned the city through his personality. Kobe wanted to be the guy who needed nobody, proving that his individual will was enough to bend the league to his liking. They'd reached a point where the other person's success felt like a personal insult. If Shaq was the reason they won, then Kobe's Mamba work ethic didn't matter. If Kobe was the reason, then Shaq's natural dominance was just a footnote. There was no middle ground left. When Shaq was traded to Miami that summer and Phil Jackson walked away, it wasn't a tragedy.
It was just a market correction. The city of LA sat in a weird, stunned silence for a bit, but it was really just the sound of everyone finally letting out a breath they'd been holding for 5 years. Looking back at it now, in 2026, the ending makes as much sense as the beginning. If they had stayed together and slowly washed out, losing in the first round for years, the legacy wouldn't feel so massive. They were a flash of lightning. And the thing about lightning is that it's bright, it's loud, and then it's over. You can't bottle it. They gave us the most concentrated stretch of talent and friction we've ever seen. They showed us you can be the best in the world and still be totally disconnected from the person standing right next to you. It turns out dominance isn't always sustainable, and success, if it's built on a fault line, eventually has to settle. I'm Jamie. This has been another episode of the Dead Ball Podcast. Sleep well.